Could you explain for the folks on the call what a technical architect is and what responsibilities that entails? I guess to give it context, right? Last week we had Abby Beatty on the call, who is, she's an architect. She is a business architect. We've had Adam speak before, program architect. So lots of different folks that have talked about the different areas of architecture. And this is a new area for us, technical architecture. So if you could just chat about what that's all about, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because, I mean, frankly, the word architect can be somewhat of a buzzword and somewhat of it's somewhat confusing and somewhat, sometimes it's a little bit overused. But my perspective is it's sort of a continuum from an overall kind of business and technology perspective. I think on one side, you have sort of that enterprise architect that kind of looks at the overall architecture from an overall enterprise perspective, right? I mean, if you're at JP Morgan or USAA or something like that, there's enterprise architects that kind of look at the overall kind of business as well as technical architecture across USAA and its like grand self. But like within from a solution architect perspective, you're more in maybe more of a specific domain area, kind of taking a look at specific business requirements and talking with the enterprise architects, and then seeing from a business requirements perspective, how do you what's the best solution, or what are the best solutions that can fit these business requirements. And so the solution architect like Abby from last week, it sort of like has to traverse both areas, specifically from a business requirements perspective. Most of the technical architects, that's where once we kind of understand sort of the business, where the company is heading from a strategy perspective, what are all the other kind of dependencies across the enterprise. That's where the technical architect has to then, given that, how do we architect this system? Let's say from the context of Salesforce, how do we architect Salesforce in a way that meets these business requirements, right? Meets all the things around these, right? And so usually from a technical architect perspective, you're thinking how do we implement single sign-on across the enterprise, right? What's the type, what's the best integration pattern that we need to configure or develop within Salesforce to make sure that it kind of meets the business requirements, right? And so from a technical architect perspective, you kind of have to talk with all of the enterprise architects and the business architects, but your main emphasis is to really understand the requirement, understand the business, but then at the end of the day, you gotta design how it's actually going to be implemented, and work with the developers to actually get Salesforce set up. So that's how I would kind of frame it in terms of sort of that architect kind of continuum. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and I appreciate you clarifying that, because obviously there's lots of different architecture paths out there, and you all work together performing cooperative but different roles. So to be able to break that down is helpful.